Good afternoon. My name is Colby. I'm an equity research analyst at the investment bank Cowen. For this panel presentation, it's called Enabling Hybrid, Insights on Edge, and Opportunity for Hyperscale. With us here, we have all the way to the right, my right, Raul Martynek, who's the CEO of DataBank from the USA. Next to him is Narendra, who's the CEO of RackBank Data Centers from India. And lastly is Jeff Uphues, who's the CEO at DC BLOX. I'm actually going to come and join you guys over there.
Sounds good.
Probably be a little awkward. So we have 25 minutes for this panel. And I guess just to start off, why don't we start with you, Raul? Can we start with each of you guys providing a less than 1 minute overview of your company?
Sure. DataBank, we're a US-based national data center operator. Today, we operate 20 data centers in 9 US markets. We tend to focus around secondary markets. So although we're based in Dallas, the other markets we focus on are places like Salt Lake, Minneapolis, Kansas City, Cleveland, Pittsburgh. So second-tier NFL cities, places that are kind of the advent of the edge, so to speak.
Hey, thank you very much for having me here. We are a data center operator platform in India. We have one data center live in central part of India. We are building another 4 data centers in India, Chennai, Mumbai, Pune, Delhi, all major locations, targeting hyperscale customers and wholesale. So yeah, that's about RackBank.
Jeff?
Yeah, thank you. So DC BLOX is a company that we're based in the United States. We're predominantly focused on the Southeast United States. We have 4 data center facilities that we interconnect all of them together and provide a low latency, 2 millisecond connection in and out of major exchanges. So think of it as, the connected data center that even though it resides hundreds of miles away from main core internet exchanges, it's tier 3 infrastructure, tier 3 data center buildings in underserved growing markets throughout the Southeast.
Great, perfect, and thank you for keeping it so brief. So we have a pretty diverse panel here, and really we're going to focus on 3 different topics. 1 is hybrid, 2 is edge, and then lastly we're going to focus on hyperscale. And I'm going to go back and forth with each of them, and hopefully can get into a really good dialogue. So first off, starting on hybrid, and we're going to start with you, Narendra. How would you describe the current competitive landscape in India for data center providers, and do you see a bigger opportunity from enterprises for colocation or managed services?
That is a good question. Our Indian ecosystem is driven by the telcos initially, setting up their own captive demand for data center, and then gradually they started serving enterprise customers. Now, if you talk about the India's demand, currently 640 million people are online, and there is huge scarcity of supply in Indian market. And the government ecosystem, Digital India by Prime Ministers, it is enabling more than 670 services online. So you do whatever you want to do, like through Aadhaar, which is online identity program run by Government of India, and they connected with all the entire ecosystem, banking, to your personal pension account and everything together, stitched together. So growth driver for the government, data protection is another thing coming up, which is driving the demand for the data center industry. And the existing operators are focusing on only Indian service provider like BFSI, banking, finance, or OTT players, and streaming, and the local services. But now we see that international large cloud providers are entering into India market. So currently only 3% capacity is deployed by hyperscale cloud providers in India. Rest 97% is outside India, and that's a huge opportunity in India. So if we talk about the competitive scenario, there's a huge gap into supply. More than 50 players required for India, and only few players, 5-6 players are available in the market. If you talk about the international players, operators, they are looking to enter into India market, but it's not an easy market. It's a difficult market because government permits take its own sweet time, 6 to 8 months, land acquisition and all other things. If you talk about the managed services and enterprise offerings, so managed services playing key role because it's getting complicated day by day. So managed is the primary, but the underlying is a co-location thing.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Raul, I appreciate that DataBank is primarily focused on selling colocation services, but how important do you think it is to be able to offer a set of managed services?
Sure. So we think it's very important. DataBank, we're 70% co-location, 30% kind of network and managed services. You know, when we think about our customer base, we divide it into kind of 3 buckets. Kind of customers that are interested in our interconnected assets. So those folks typically aren't interested in managed services. And then technology companies, which, you know, obviously the cloud and content players that everyone knows about, but just kind of, as I call it, the long tail of technology businesses. Those also don't tend to be interested in managed services because they're very sophisticated technical organizations. But for the 50% of our customers that are enterprises, that's where we see kind of the interest from them for managed services, and specifically around security and compliance, because those are areas that, you know, as an enterprise, they need to dedicate resources to, and it's an area where, as a data center operator, we can offload a lot of that headache from them. So I think it's an important piece, but for a subsegment of your customer base. If, you know, you can have a conversation with a customer and they make the decision because of your ability to offer some managed services, and then you'll have a conversation with a customer that might look relatively similar, and they don't need those managed services, so it's not important to them.
Raul, just sticking with you for a minute, Equinix recently announced that they made an acquisition of a company called Packet, which I'll generically call a managed service. Just curious what your thoughts on that acquisition, and I guess as part of that, just a bare metal offering.
Sure. Pretty familiar with that company. Zach Smith, the CEO, and I worked together in a previous company about 10 years ago called Voxel. I was, you know, what people don't really maybe not know about Equinix is that they have been doing or expanding their kind of product set into, obviously on the network side, and also, you know, some things around managed firewalls and things like that. So the Packet acquisition, I guess, could be in keeping with those types of extension of the product set, but ultimately, you know, bare metal or whatever you call it is, you know, is servers. It's dedicated infrastructure. It's an IaaS platform, and that's something that, you know, seems is very different than colocation. So in a way, I guess I have 2 thoughts on it. That, you know, you could look at it as a natural extension of some of the moves they've made from a product perspective, but in another way, I think you can look at it as a pretty significant departure from their core business model around, you know, power, ping, and pipe, and really getting into a segment that kind of competes with a lot of its existing customers. So it'll be interesting to see how that evolves.
And Jeff, in our prep discussion, you mentioned that you're seeing opportunities for new enterprise networks at the edge. Can you expand on that?
Yeah, well, the enterprise is continually dealing with lots of different complexities, whether it's you know, how am I going to manage content? How am I going to get to the cloud? How am I going to be able to drive, you know, IoT applications, or, you know, large storage? You know, so within the markets that we're in, we're seeing a network effect that, in essence, if you are an enterprise and you're in a market like Birmingham, Alabama, where we have a 31,000 square foot facility, we're becoming more of like the nexus of connectivity in that market. So large enterprises in the market, they need to have connectivity to the cloud. How do they do that? In many cases, we'll lease even dark fiber in the market, connect them up to our data center. It starts to become like Grand Central, because when we bring in the content providers of the cable MSOs, the wireless and the mobile operators, you bring in all the carriers, it gives them a lot more ability to then connect to all the different types of providers that are out there. So we connect them back into the main core internet exchanges. In the case of Birmingham, we're connected into Atlanta, we're connected to Montgomery, we've now connected into Dallas, and now it gives us a capacity to, you know, give them multiple handoffs to access all these cloud providers.
Where does a Megaport or a Packet Fabric or a console, do those fit in that ecosystem or that strategy?
They do. They're great, and you know, we use Megaport today as some of the handoffs for our cloud-based customers. But I think what they're doing is they're giving this simplicity approach to many of the large enterprises that want to connect to multiple providers. So if you want to connect into Azure, you want to connect into you know, GCP, you want to connect into you know, AWS, it creates that single unified login to get there. In our case, those customers still at the edge that I talked about are in these underserved markets. You have to meet them out in Atlanta, So what we do is even customers in Huntsville, Alabama, which is a really large government facility that we have to handle, Rocket Command and NASA and a lot of other things, you still have to get down to where Megaport is, which is in Atlanta. So we then use them to drive it around our network from our Huntsville facility down on a private network, which creates that super low latency. So those guys are very, very helpful.
Great. I want to shift over just to try and get through a bunch in a short period of time. So talking about the edge, but Jeff, I do want to stick with you. So is the edge just a smart way to redefine these tier 2 data center markets, or is there something more to it when you think of the edge?
Well, there's more. I mean, things continually change. And where we see that content, we hear of gaming and we hear of a lot of the other applications get pushed out, or super low latency applications get pushed out into these underserved yet growing markets. We're starting to see some of that effect. So there's more when you add in mobile, you add in the different applications, and what I mentioned about how do you tie them into one nexus of connectivity. You give the market the option to say, you've become the centralized place where all cloud services get accessed, and you can do so in a very high quality way. So we're seeing more and more of this.
Okay. And Narendra, how do you see the concept of edge emerging in India?
So the concept of edge is very initial stage. It's the primary requirement is not able to fulfill which hyperscale needs. We need a basic infrastructure at this point of time. But yes, enterprises and I think IoT industry, IoT need that. The data center transformation from local SMB data center, which they are moving to the central, outsource their data center strategy, but we are in the mid of that. So existing data center which is in the factory, it is still there. They are not closing out. So I think they are running some IoT devices and machines to optimize their compute and all those things on the site or the site. So enterprises and industry usage is there, but I think 5G rollout, after 5G rollout, maybe the more use case will come. The another thing in India is smart cities. More than 200 smart cities being announced. It's been 5 years now, and most of the cities, which is like more than 67 cities, has a population more than 1 million people. And those smart cities now started deploying the smart pole and some smart cameras for surveillance and all those things. So they are started utilizing it, and I think that's a starting point. But after 5G rollout, the full use case we'll be able to see in another 5 years.
And Raul, in my opinion, cloud provider edge strategies thus far have really been a function of edging out from their original availability zones or their core into more markets. But we're now actually starting to see them roll out edge-specific products, including AWS Outposts and local zones. What do you think makes now the right time for these launches that we're seeing from some of these cloud providers?
Yeah, that's great. Great question, Colby. Obviously
you came up with it, so.
AWS's announcement around local zones, and obviously where do they pick as their first market? It was LA, right? So, I've kind of been thinking about this whole edge thing in the cloud guys, and kind of my new definition of the edge is anywhere there isn't a current availability zone, right? So for an AWS, right, where they're obviously Ashburn, a big availability zone, Columbus, Ohio, up in Oregon. LA is a place that obviously isn't close to any of those locations, and preferably it was for kind of gaming applications, so that's why you would place it in a local area like LA, right? But LA is a big metro, right? So you don't necessarily think of that as an edge market. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the edge is going to be defined by where existing assets are, and it's going to be different for different people. So for Amazon, the edge is not going to be Ashburn because that's where they have compute and storage today. So obviously there's already proximity there, but a market like Houston or Chicago or Atlanta would be an edge, but it could be different for a Google Compute Engine or an Azure, depending on where their availability zone. So I think you're going to start to see these things appear in different markets that will be based on different reasons, different use cases. But ultimately, it is a great development in that, we finally have gotten to a point where it seems like more distributed data center infrastructure is what needs to happen for the next phase here of the evolution.
Yeah, it seems like edge is more of a concept than it is a definition.
Now it's actually manifested itself in a physical place.
And I guess, Jeff, we've also seen AWS roll out Wavelengths, which is an edge product focused on 5G. And I heard some controversy in some other panels this morning, but what relationship do you see between the edge and 5G?
Well, we're starting to see a little bit of it, and that application of as carriers start getting ready to deploy and they start taking on larger and larger markets, they're finding that they need to have much more of a place where you can have that outpost or have some type of an edge node that is closer to where that wireless deployment is happening. We're starting to see it. We haven't seen a whole lot of it yet, as edge is starting to roll out in some of the bigger markets and we're in the smaller markets. But overall, I think it's going to make a big impact. Big impact for us. And when we define the edge as where the network meets the application. And that may be your cell phone, it may be on your PC tablet, it may be in your television screen, it may be in a data center, but it has to be in a data center somewhere to collect that, whether it's a large data center or a small data center. So when we see 5G and we see where it's rolling out, we think that's going to be one of the large enablers first of where you'll start seeing more of the AWS outposts or other local compute nodes. You just can't get it there. Like we see storage is a big one. That's probably the largest application that we see today. Take somebody who creates a lot of storage and you have to push a lot of these large files. If you're trying to push it to Ashburn, you're trying to push it to Chicago, you're trying to push it to the West Coast, and then getting it out of there, it's just too, the throughput is not there, from the size of the network. So keeping that locally with an edge, location, whether it's an outpost or other, it'll give some flexibility to that enterprise.
Yeah, I think it goes back to what Raul said, which is, or was making the point, which is that the edge doesn't have a specific definition and it's different from everybody. And I think that these edge deployments that will happen in these MECs or mobile edge computing or locations is just one of many options. And I think for those that are more low latency sensitive, maybe that makes sense. But for some of these others, operating something out of a DataBank or out of a DC BLOX type facility is going to be perfectly suitable as well. Raul, you said that a lot of edge requirements can and are being served out of data centers in secondary markets. Do you think demand for edge will ultimately result in a new subsegment of data center or edge node locations that don't exist today?
Yeah, that's obviously a term, I guess the micro edge is one word I've heard for it, kind of containerized solutions. I think in a way we're just kind of returning to where we started, right? Which is we all remember infrastructure used to live in office buildings, in people's houses, and over the last 10 years it's been sucked into these kind of core locations. But ultimately, with the continued consumption of technology, there's going to be a requirement to push some of that infrastructure out. So one of the edge micro data center companies I know about, I was meeting with the CEO and he told me about a deployment that they just did in Iowa. I was like, really, in Iowa? Why there? Well, because they're using drones and different technologies to farm better, and that requires computation, processing, storage of data. So there's somewhere where a container makes a lot of sense, right? You can drop it into the middle of 30,000 acres, and you can get all that data to that location, and obviously figure out how to tether it back. So I do think that there will be more and more of those types of use cases, but really just driven by the fact that humans continue to consume technology, and as these technologies get consumed, they live on servers, and then those servers need to live in a data center. So if the data center isn't close to you, well, you can bring the data center on a flatbed truck and create it.
I think that there's going to be a logical need for it. I think my debate or question I have is can the business scale? Can it actually become a real business, an independent business? So if you think about the Vapor IO, the Edge Micro, the dark points and so forth, these companies are trying to make a real business out of it. How many of those facilities do you really need to have before you actually have something that's meaningful in terms of financial wherewithal? That's probably going to be, I think, a bigger challenge.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge, and also obviously by the fact that it's such a small chunk, the barrier to entry from a capital perspective isn't as great as building a traditional data center, right? You build a traditional data center, you got to spend $50 million. An edge container is a number much smaller than that, so a lot of the end users might be able to self-perform on that.
With the time we have left, I want to focus more on hyperscale. And Narendra, you've talked about hyperscale a little bit already in some of your remarks, but I wanted to get a current update on your view of the age-old question in the data center sector, which is, do you think that public cloud is good or bad for third-party data center providers?
So I think public cloud is good for third-party data centers in emerging market especially, because that is driving the demand for a player like us. And more, because cloud is easy to adopt, and cloud in our world, it's a buzzword. All the CEOs and CTOs adopting it, and it's easy to adopt and easy to scale. So that's why I think that's driving demand for data center as well. And the other thing is what we use as a RackBank, like we have seen the growth. Private cloud has come forward. A lot of in India, open source easily you can get it, and people started deploying private cloud, and they are using colocation services, right, to optimize their costs, reduce their costs. Once they go on the public cloud, then they move to private cloud to reduce the dollars. So that trend we have seen in India.
And Jeff, Raul, in the United States, I mean, do you think of public cloud as friend or foe?
I think it's friend. I think it's been good for enterprises. You know, prices have come down substantially. If you look at the price per, what people are getting charged, on a
for colocation,
for colocation, like in a market of, Ashburn. But if you look at a secondary provider like us, it's been good for the enterprise to have good competitive pricing. We don't feel the pricing, that much into some of these underserved secondary markets. But we see it's been good. I mean, I think that I believe that the world is a place of abundance, and there's enough for everybody to drive the co-location close to where some of these large hyperscalers are, which will solve latency. In our case, we're close to quite a few of the large hyperscale facilities, which creates that latency application that you can be near them but not next, not with them, not inside their facility. And I think it's great for the industry.
And did you have a view on that, Raul?
Yeah, my view is that it's a double-edged sword, right? That ultimately it feeds data center supply and demand. So there's no doubt the large public clouds and kind of the top, call it 20 or 25 applications that are out there on the internet consume a lot of third-party colocation. But at the same time, I think it's unquestionable that it does have a cannibalistic aspect to it for certain workloads. So in some cases it gives, and in some cases it takes away. So far, obviously, because the sector's still growing overall, I think it's a net positive. Obviously, you just don't know what the future's going to hold.
Okay, and Narendra, going back to you, you've talked about the need for hyperscalers to come into, or cloud providers to come into India. You've talked about what you guys are doing, but are they able to self-build there? What are some of the things that are going to prevent them from building themselves, and why they're likely to continue to need someone like you guys?
So I think for their strategy should work along with the TC, or total cost of ownership. But India is a difficult market. The political stability is, so emerging market is always difficult for these players. They don't want to go with regulatory compliances. Their standards are different, and emerging market has their own challenges to bring power, fiber, and everything put together. It takes their own sweet time. So I think they will come and enter into the India market, but once the global players will first establish, and afterwards they will come to India. They are exploring. From last 2 years they are exploring, but nobody has come forward and put a foot on the ground. So and that's why I think local players play a good role to help them to reduce their capex, fast delivery time. So what are the challenges they are having in India? They are not able to get the demand on time, supply on time, and the quality bill, and speed to market. And the biggest aspect in India, what they can have with Indian player is 100% clean energy. So these are the 4 aspects. So any player who is going to offer this, they don't need to build, because we believe that India, you can build data center in $4 million to $5 million per megawatt.
Wow.
Because the fact behind this is 80% components being manufactured locally in India. Number 1, the labor cost is cheap. Third, the operation cost is again cheap. And the solar is subsidized by the government. So it's like 30% cheaper than a grid price, power grid price. The cost of solar is 30% cheaper. So why should they build, you know?
Great.
They need a reliable partner like us.
Okay, well, hopefully in our 25 minutes, you learned a little bit about hybrid, edge, and hyperscale. But with 7 seconds left, we're going to conclude and thank our panelists. Appreciate it.